Hey guys, today at Noetic we'll be inaugurating a new seminar series. We have taken on the very ambitious task to cover all of Kant's religion within the bounds of mere reason alone. I estimate that this will probably be a 10, 12, 15 part seminar that we do. We're going to take it 10, 15 pages at a time. As far as I know, there isn't an intensive, exhaustive seminar like this available on the internet. But if you're listening to this in the year 2500, perhaps that's all changed and we look like fools. The thing is with Kant, the reason why I wanted to address Kant is not only that I think it helps me with my particular work on Soren Kierkegaard, but I think there's a certain gravitas and an adult-like nature that covering people like Kant communicates to a wider audience if you embrace him. And it forces one to mature as a teacher. So saying all of that, I think Matt and I, we don't claim to be authorities on Kant, and very few people probably could. We are going to do our best to communicate the ideas within Kant's work on religion as best we can, but it will evolve. There are going to be some things that obviously we'll have to amend and go back through the seminars. We may only be a couple steps ahead of where you are, but that's fine, because we're innovating. And I think I'm going to stop with the disclaimers and then just kind of get down to our mission here, which is fighting our way through Kant's religion within the boundaries of mere reason. So to begin this, I believe Matt wanted to give some background to this text.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to understand what's happening here in this first essay of the Cambridge text in the History of Philosophy edition. The first essay in it is, what does it mean to orient oneself in thinking? And to understand what Kant is saying here, you have to understand a little bit about the background of why he wrote this and the particular controversy he's involving himself in. So Kant is actually responding to what is known in the history of philosophy as the pantheism controversy. So you had the thinker Baruch or Benedict Spinoza, who argued for a type of pantheism, a very pantheistic conception of God, that subsequently was also deterministic. So there were a few things that happened. Spinoza was thought to be, one, an atheist. People accused him of not really thinking that there was even a God. And two, that he was a fatalist, that free will was an illusion, and that human actions, freedom doesn't exist, and that people are fated to do what they do, which someone like Friedrich Jacobi comes along and says leads to nihilism. And so you had this conflict arise between Friedrich Jacobi and Moses Mendelssohn, who was a Jewish thinker and a defender of the Enlightenment, which Jacobi argued against. Jacobi saw reason alone, without faith, as leading to atheism, fatalism, nihilism, which at the time were considered very extreme charges. So Moses Mendelssohn, the Jewish defender of the Enlightenment and of reason, was friends with the darling of the Enlightenment, G.E. Lessing. Lessing is the one who said that if he approached God and God said, "In my right hand I have all knowledge, and in my left hand the desire for knowledge," Lessing would say, "I'll take your left hand, Lord, because pure knowledge, absolute knowledge, total knowledge is only for you." So Lessing was considered the darling of the Enlightenment, the darling of those who sought knowledge through reason alone. And Lessing and Mendelssohn had a legendary friendship between this Christian Enlightenment thinker and this Jewish thinker. And so they had a really close friendship. It was the stuff of legend. And then at one point, Jacobi, in his crusade against Enlightenment reason, reached out to Mendelssohn and told him about an encounter he had had with Lessing, in which Lessing had told him that he was a Spinozist, which would have meant something like atheist, fatalist, nihilist. which would have helped Jacobi's case that reason alone leads to nihilism, atheism, and fatalism. So he reaches out to Moses Mendelssohn, and the two of them get into this historic argument about whether faith or reason is the proper starting point of knowledge. With Jacobi saying faith is, you have to start from faith, and faith is you're trusting with certainty the intuitions you're receiving. That's faith, and that intuition gives you knowledge of God, and it gives you knowledge that the world actually exists, and so forth. Whereas Mendelssohn said you have to begin with reason, but Jacobi argued to Mendelssohn and said it's like you're standing on your head when you do that. You have to do a salto mortale, a mortal leap, wrongly translated leap of faith, to end up on the proper ground of faith. In his response, defending reason, Mendelssohn had what he called his method of orientation, where he said that common sense, our intuition, which is usually right, but is impulsive and doesn't think everything through, walks along with speculation, and when these two diverge is when we have problems in our acquisition of knowledge. So the goal is to come back to reason, and reason arbitrates between common sense and speculative thought. Now the problem is that Mendelssohn's interpretation of common sense, speculation, and reason becomes muddled, and it becomes really unclear whether reason is in charge, common sense, speculation, and which one is supposed to side with whom, and this method of orientation gets very muddled and potentially hurts Mendelssohn's argument. Now, in addition to this, you have another thinker, Thomas Wiseman, who comes in, who unfortunately died early at the age of 27, but he wrote the book Results, which Kant refers to in this piece, and he argues that Jacobi's right that you need to have faith and that reason leads to atheism and fatalism, but he disagrees with Jacobi when Jacobi says it happens through intuition, which Wiseman says isn't that much different than Mendelssohn's common sense. And Wiseman says knowledge of God comes through revelation, and revelation alone, and not through intuition. So you have all these things happening here, and Kant addresses all of these thinkers throughout, as we'll see as we go through. There's an allusion here, obviously, to Mendelssohn, who Kant affirmed in that Mendelssohn was trying to defend reason, but he thinks that Mendelssohn is too dogmatic about what reason can and cannot tell us about God. And so he critiques Mendelssohn, but he also affirms Mendelssohn's love of reason while critiquing Wiseman's understanding of revelation or inspiration, as well as Jacobi's understanding of faith.
That was excellent, Matt. I mean, that's not only illuminating for everyone that's listening to this, wherever they may be, but for myself. I tended in my reading of this to sort of extract Kant from the historical contextualization, because I had to sort of prioritize the ideas over the influences of those ideas, but I can see how that's going to marry nicely with everything that we talk about. Your command of that is pretty spellbinding. I really enjoyed listening to that. Thank you. So, something that I wanted to do, and this is going to be an evolving list, is try to get our head around some of the prolix, pretentious jargon that Kant employs, not only here in his religion, but throughout all the critiques. This list that I've compiled is by no means comprehensive. I do not, as I look at it right now, it's completely blank. I had enough time to write down about 20 different terms that I thought would be important for kind of getting our head around the major lessons of today's seminar. What's probably going to happen, those of you that are listening right now, you may be listening way into the future, so you'll probably have these notes available to you on the Noetic app, totally completed and written out. But for right now, we're going to just sort of take our best stab at what we think these terms mean, the limited knowledge that we have of the first three critiques, how they're used in the religion, and as we go through each seminar, we'll update them. So we're going to do a little free association here, Matt, and I kind of maybe we'll take turns or something like that. I don't mean to interrogate you, but I think if we just sort of launch right into Kant without talking about some of the preliminary terminology, people are going to tune out pretty quickly, because a lot of this stuff is very difficult to get our heads around. So The first one, and perhaps more difficult than anything, is trying to understand what a concept is. Kant will use this term concept pretty frequently, and I would imagine that if we were to consult the secondary literature, there's probably like 100 papers on what a concept means for Kant. But how do you understand a concept? And maybe as we talk about concepts, we can talk about particular concepts that he's interested in the religion, specifically supersensible concepts, and what those may be and what those may look like. So maybe you can say, because I know you're kind of you're doing a parallel reading of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, you might be able to fill out a little bit more of the more pedestrian forms of concepts, and maybe I could say a little bit more about what it means to have a supersensible concept.
Yeah, from what I understand, so Kant has a famous saying: "Thoughts without content are empty; intuitions without concepts are blind." So, in some ways, to answer concepts, it might be easier to talk about intuitions.
Please do.
So,
it's also on my list.
It is. But it's 4 down. So, but we'll skip it. So, intuitions are that space where, as a professor of mine has written, where our minds and the world meet. So, when we look out at the world, we have all these things that are represented to us. We have these. Later on, Kant also uses image representations. We have all these things represented to us. And these are given to us as representations. And then our intuitions are, it's kind of like, should we talk about the noumena and phenomena? Because I feel like...
I think it's unavoidable. Why don't you? We'll hit it all.
Yeah, so for Kant... we don't experience the world. When we're experiencing the world, Kant separates what he calls the phenomena from the noumena. So the noumena is the world in and of itself. So this Luke right here, that as I experience this Luke, there's Luke, the Luke in and of himself, or of itself, and then there's Luke as I encounter Luke. And I can only encounter Luke as a phenomena in my own reception of who Luke is in my own mind, through things like representation,
through your sense perception.
Yes.
There are certain accidental aspects of myself that your sense faculty take in, and then concepts are applied to them. So those would be the intuitions that are sort of accidentally taken in through your sensibility.
Yes.
And then you apply concepts to it in order to get a phenomenological image of Luke, right? Would that be the right way to say? But then what Luke actually is, in and of himself, Luke's free intelligence, is consigned to another place, the noumenological realm, that you do not necessarily have access to.
I mean, Luke's body, this table, everything. I don't have access to those things in themselves. I, as Matthew Brake, only have access to phenomena, the phenomenal world, not the noumenal world.
Right.
So the intuitions are where the phenomenal and the noumena, the phenomenon and the noumena meet, where the world in and of itself in my mind meet. And that's what I have are my intuitions. And then concepts are used, like you said, to organize those intuitions into something intelligible.
What are some of the do you know any of the concepts? Because it's been a while since I've done the Critique of Pure Reason. Oh, well, okay.
Well, I know. I feel like one of them is time determination, right?
Yeah.
So, like, for us, one of the concepts that helps to organize our intuitions is something like time determination. So how can we tell that as I watch this glass move by my face and not drop onto my computer, hopefully, I watch this go by, how can I tell that now it's here, now it's here, now it's here, now it's here? That's a concept of time determination that helps me make sense of the intuitions I'm receiving.
Yeah.
And so, so time determination, that's one. And there are...
We don't have to go into all of them, but that would be a good enough example. So, all right. So we're given this... I think the big takeaway here is that individuals should understand that as Kant sees it, reality is something constructed by the very schematization of our minds.
Yes.
Right? Okay. It's going to be this complex interaction between the noumenological world, our intuitions, and concepts that produce the phenomenology that is within, that we consider to be reality. Yes. Right? Now, you might be able to say, because this is something in the first critique, that there might be uniformity of the perception of reality amongst all human beings. But we're not going to concern ourselves too much with that. But so we've covered intuitions, we've covered concepts, we've covered the distinction between noumenological and phenomenological. I think we need what's going to be a big concept, which we will dwell on a lot throughout this seminar, is what it means for there to be a supersensible concept. Okay, and supersensible means, well, like if you break down the etymology of whatever, you're going beyond experience. You're going beyond what can be experienced, and so a supersensible concept would be something like God. Other supersensible concepts presumably would be immortality of the soul, maybe even freedom itself. I'm not sure. We'll have to see. I'm going to bracket that and put that kind of to the side. We'll come back and see what exactly the qualities of the supersensible concepts are. But supersensible concepts aren't going to find manifestations, empirical manifestations within reality. They're going to be sort of free-floating. There can't be... So the concepts of God and the soul are not going to be things that can be proven. They're not going to be proven because there isn't going to be an intuition that can be supplied to that concept.
Right.
Is what I'm saying correct?
Right.
All right. So for Kant, the existence of God, the existence of the soul, can neither be proven or not proven. But that doesn't mean that they don't have a use, and that's going to be something that we're going to discuss a lot with it about in this text. They're going to have an experiential sort of function, and we'll get more into that. But I think that's just good for right now. And when we're talking about this, one of the phrases that I have down here, concrete act of understanding, I understand that to be how this sort of all magically comes together in the understanding, how we fashion the reality of applying concepts to intuitions. Would you agree with that sort of very tentative definition of concrete act of understanding?
Sure.
Okay. If I can keep going here. What about common sense or healthy reason? So this is going to be distinct from pure theoretical reason, right? We're going to talk about, with common reason or healthy reason, that there are perhaps going to be practical needs that impinge upon reason that get us to certain conclusions, right? That we wouldn't necessarily be able to make theoretically.
Right.
Okay. We'll fill out that definition more. Orientation is going to be a big sort of conversation in this. I like it a lot because Kant says that there is a subjective sort of understanding. Specifically, he uses
subjective ground.
The subjective ground. He takes the example of us kind of intrinsically knowing the difference between our right and our left hand, so that if we were to sort of go out on the roads or whatever, we could find our way home. If we were put into a dark room, we would be able to feel our way around to get some sort of stability or something like that. Or if we were put in sort of an empty space, we always have this sort of sense of right from left. We're able to orient ourselves within the world. And if we do that in sort of there's a geographical sort of orientation, and then there's sort of a mathematical orientation if we're kind of just put into like Tron or something like that. I think a lot of this we've talked about so far. Contingency. What could we say about contingency, maybe?
Accidental things that happen in the world, things that seem accidental.
Things that seem accidental, right?
Accidental, maybe if you're a bit more of a fatalist or a determinist who thinks that there's no such thing as freedom or free will. But yeah, contingency, things that at least seem accidental.
Right, and I mean, I think maybe he started talking about how the world in total could be contingent. Versus, and I guess what we could say about the difference between contingent and necessary. You can talk about there being things that are necessitated logically, in other ways. I don't know how much more we can say about necessary at this particular moment. Purposiveness. Kant seems to be very sympathetic, maybe to my surprise, to the idea of there being a teleological argument for the existence of God, which would be sort of, I sort of understand the teleological argument for the existence of God to be a little bit like a divine artificer argument, that it's nearly impossible to look at the contingent aspects of the world and see how they're lined up and not get to the conclusion that there is some sort of divine author. So there's going to sort of be a arc or trajectory to nature, right? How do you feel about that?
I feel good about it, Luke.
Okay. What about this distinction between conditioned and unconditioned?
With that language, I actually was a little bit...
We don't have to have the answer right now.
I know as he was using that language, I was a little bit confused. Can you provide any clarity on that?
Well, I try to think about what would be something that would be unconditioned. I tend to think about something that has no limits. So I would necessarily think that God would be something unconditioned, whereas other things are conditioned. I think we'll probably have to come back to that one. I don't think I have enough information to really fill it out just yet. Freedom. We typically think about that in regards to ethical freedom.
Yeah.
Kant is very famous for his ethical dictate, the categorical imperative, that we're supposed to act on moral virtue, this moral law, simply to liberate ourselves from the world of contingent experiences, so we're not led around like a donkey.
Yeah.
And we experience our autonomy in embracing this rational law for ourselves, and it can be extended to everybody else. What's going to be very interesting about the categorical imperative and all the stuff that we're talking about with reason and God and rational faith and all of that stuff is how you can then go and have something like a belief in God and an afterlife if moral virtue is entirely predicated on reason and just doing the right thing because it's rational.
Yeah.
And how it doesn't get tainted by some sort of incentive for reward or punishment.
Yeah, also interesting about freedom is it's another one of those things that, like God, the soul, and afterlife and so forth, it's one of those things that we don't get an experience. This is also another way of Kant. This is one of the ways that this relates to Kant's phenomena noumena, that by placing freedom into the noumena and something unavailable to us in experience, this is one of the ways he gets out of the question of determinism by saying that freedom is a noumenal element.
Yeah. I believe is it one of the antinomies in the first critique? Freedom.
I think
it's God, immortality, soul, and freedom. I'm not sure. We'll have to brush up on it. I have these sufficient, necessary, insufficient. Well, I think those terms will become more obvious as we get into the text. The highest good. The highest good is probably something we can say something in a preliminary fashion about, if we have not already. The highest good, as I understand it, is that there are these ideas that moral action virtue ought to be sort of rewarded with a certain amount of happiness. And in order for that to happen, for finite beings, they have to postulate that there is a God and that there is an afterlife where we sort of continuously work on our moral perfection and we're rewarded with happiness or something like that. That is a very rough and shoddy explanation of what the highest good may be. Hopefully it will become refined throughout our whole story. We are learning right here with you folks in real time. So, everything we're saying here is, going to be improved upon. Knowing versus opinion. I think maybe we can say a little bit more about this, maybe? Something to this effect?
Yeah.
Knowing is going to be something like we've talked about earlier when you have concept and intuition married in order to get that reality or whatever. Opinion is just going to be something that one opines. It's possible that evidence can come to bear that will substantiate the concept or the theory that's put forward, but until that happens, it's mere opinion.
Yeah.
Right? And the interesting thing is, because we have a supersensible concept in God is not going to be something that can be rationally known. God is not going to be something that can be theoretically known. So, in a way, I don't want to, maybe it's not right to say this because we have this conversation of the difference between hypothesis and opinion hypothesis, opinion, and postulation coming up, is that God can't be known for Kant, but that doesn't stop him from postulating God.
Yeah.
And it's an important distinction for us to begin to prick at as we get into the material. And similarly, cognition, right? We can't really, because there aren't intuitions of God. You don't have these burning. See, for Kant, we're not going to have like burning bushes and like Jesus Christ is like the Son of God, or maybe we will. We'll see. To say
there's an interesting. He makes an interesting comment about that.
Yeah, we'll get that later in the book, but who can't really have cognition of God and the soul and maybe freedom and stuff like that too. What about can we say anything maybe that we haven't already said about rational hypothesis and how that's different from, say, a postulate? We've talked about that. I guess a rational hypothesis is something that we can wait for and that evidence can come in for.
Well,
or it's like I know what
it relates to knowing.
It's to well,
being able to potentially know versus it's something that you potentially. The potential exists that you could possibly know.
I don't think so. I thought a rational hypothesis was purely theoretical, and it would forever sort of keep itself out of the realm of knowledge. So, like, if reason has a speculative dimension and reason has a practical dimension, you're not going to. Or a rational hypothesis will forever remain a hypothesis because there's nothing that's going to come in that's going to allow us to know God speculatively, right? But whereas a postulate is like the practical path, and there's not going to be nothing that's going to. There's sort of the difference between the theoretical and the practical. It'll come out more, but it doesn't seem like there's the possibility for knowledge of these things. I don't know. That was my read of it. We'll keep going with it. And then this rational faith. All right, rational faith. I have it more defined later in my notes, but rational faith is going to be something to the effect of what I've talked about earlier, that as a result of being morally virtuous individuals, we're going to have to make these postulations of God and an afterlife and maybe some other stuff. The rational concept of God, Kant doesn't really give us a lot of ideas of what that God is. He does think it comes before all experiences of God, so It allows us to adjudicate.
It is that against which, especially when we talk about, when we were talking about, like, you mentioned the burning bush and all those things, Kant isn't necessarily dismissing the potential for a burning bush or even Christ appearing in the sky or any of that. What he is saying is that when we have those experiences, we test them against the rational concept of God.
Right.
Which is interesting because Kierkegaard, in the book of Adler, says something similar about Adler, that in his religious experiences, he needed to have a Christian concept to fold them into instead of letting them run him all around.
Yeah. And I think the rational concept of God is something that we get from the examination of the world. I have a quote later on in my notes that sort of says, like, in order for us to have a sort of understanding of the limited world, we have to have a notion of that which is unlimited. So I don't know how much we can say about the rational concept of God right now, but maybe that it's just the foundation of everything and that it's unlimited. But what do we know if, like, God, what God is interested in or anything like that? Like, Kant hasn't defined that for us yet here in this first opening salvo of Kant's religion. Enthusiasm, I think that's an important thing to talk about. I think he thinks if we don't create these delimits for religion, it gives way to a lot of different things: enthusiasm, superstition, nihilism, atheism. A lot of people think that Kant, like, was anti-religion, but there's a quote in the religion, Kant's Religion Within the Bounds of Mere Reason, where he felt like he had to rein in reason to make room for faith, right?
Yeah.
So he's not necessarily anti-faith, but what he thinks, if you go outside of reason and just you start getting into, like, snake handling and all sorts of cult-like behavior and stuff like that, that the faith tradition or whatever has to be judged against these rational concepts, and superstition and stuff like that too. One of the last things I want to say is talk a little bit about libertinism. I think he also thinks that if we don't listen to the dictates of reason and the boundaries of reason, then ultimately we give ourselves over to our appetites and the appetites of others, so that we become enslaved. We lose our freedom and our autonomy that we've fought so hard for. And the unbelief of reason, I think, is something, another phrase that will come up. The unbelief of reason is something that Kant believes a lot of people who are just concerned, maybe a lot of philosophers are guilty of this, philosophers who only concern themselves with speculative philosophy and therefore won't make any sort of faith commitments like God or something like that, and therefore they're sort of opening the door to a lot of this enthusiasm, superstition, libertinism, and nihilism. So those are some of the things I have. These are not exhaustive. We will improve upon them, but hopefully we have oriented the section on what does it mean to orient oneself in thinking.
Well, one more thought too on superstition.
Yes.
Superstition, he says, is belief in historical fact. So again, like this idea of superstition, which is something I believe Spinoza says too. This idea that superstition is when you join historical fact to belief, but again, you're not using reason. Like reason is still missing, like just believing a historical fact. So like superstition is this weird combination of history and belief versus enthusiasm, which is just belief for belief's sake. And so rational faith, by contrast, is when things arise out of the need of reason, which we'll get into later.
Yeah, and I think a very important question we'll have to ask ourselves throughout this is, did Kant view Christianity itself, because it does involve historical fact, as a form of superstition? I think in this opening salvo, it's ambiguous, and that hinges a lot on who the figure of Christ is. Is Christ merely the best example of the categorical imperative, or is he actually the Son of God? And I don't think we know enough yet to know what Kant thinks about this. So maybe we should just kind of get into the philosophy of it now. So yeah.
Do we want to make this a part one?
Sure. Let's go ahead and make this a part one, and we'll regroup and do a part two. All right. All right. Be back.